Hi, my name is Doug Lucas. I serve as president of Team Expansion. We're making this Framing Our Lives series specifically for Team Expansion workers. But if you are not one and just are happening to join us, welcome. We're glad you're listening in. We're going to speak specifically to our Team Expansion family members. And if you pick something up, God be praised. So we're continuing on this trek of trying to figure out how we're going to frame our lives. You might recall that we started out with our left frame, talking about the basics, getting it down pat, trying to figure out how we were going to put together, essentially like our great passions say, God, prayer, and people as well. So we're talking about combining the Bible and prayer and good planning, maybe some personal stuff as well, getting the right sleep, getting the right connections with your family, with exercise, and something fun now and then wouldn't hurt as well. The top part of the frame that we talked about last night, that's that element of taking initiative. And we talked about how this involved assessing the situation so that we made good decisions and trained properly. It also talked about, though, the other side of that coin is that it was probably going to involve some risk, and you all have already taken risks just by getting involved and traveling to one of these 50 countries where Team Expansion workers are serving. Really, it's just a follow through with your calling, the calling that already took you there, and being proactive rather than reactive. We're talking about really relational stewardship with those you're trying to reach, and we let this list of 100 sort of represent that, kind of to be the epitome of that, making sure that they all would hear the good news. We said that it's just as simple as trying to do the next right thing, maybe striving to reach just one more, and pushing ourselves so that that would happen, so that just one more person could be snatched from darkness eternally. We mentioned our passion for creative strategic perseverance until the results are achieved. And we said that's kind of who we stand for. It's who we are. That's what our culture is. And so now we're starting to frame our lives, try to figure out what the right side is in this video. And the one we're going to include now in this third part of the series is the responsibility we have and the opportunity we have to communicate. This is what we talk about in our great passions when you talk about effective communication. In this epoch, more than ever before, it discerns its own side of the frame of our lives. Because why? Well, because first of all, we've had to isolate ourselves more than ever before. Think about it. We've had no hugs. We've had probably few smiles from other people. And on very short notice, some of us have had to quarantine ourselves. Some of us have had to evacuate. We've done this self-isolating thing after a flight or social distancing by state mandate. It reminds me of that wall that surrounded that city in the movie Divergent. You probably might not have seen that, but it was a stark, tall thing, and it separated the city from knowing what was on the outside, made them feel so isolated that they felt, to be honest, they felt like they were less than what they should have, and they didn't respect themselves anymore to a certain extent. They were bothered by this idea of being cut off, and that's the very way that we've all been living, and we don't know how much longer we will have to live this way, depending on the part of the world you are in tonight. When you hear this recording, it could be quite a bit worse before it gets better. That separation can create misinformation. It can create misunderstandings. It can create mistrust, and it can tear us apart from the inside out. Like I say, we're not sure how long it will last. There are states here in the United States that are pushing the envelope a little bit. We have one state that's already starting to relax as of this very day. When you're receiving this recording, they're already starting to relax their social distancing with establishments like, I guess, tattoo parlors and all kinds of other establishments that are going to increase touch and connection with people at a time when they are probably only, 5 or 10 days into even reducing the difference that they've shown previously in acquiring the virus. And by some models and some measurements, that state is still picking up in infections? It's just hard to say because there's so little testing available, and that state's not meeting yet the requirement for testing. They're not meeting the very guidelines that our federal government have set for them, but they're still going headlong into relaxing social distancing. So if the prophets of doom are correct, it could create a second wave all over again, which could reproduce the isolation all over again. Now, I know I'm not one to try to say that we're headed down the wrong road. I'm not a politician. I've already told you I'm not an epidemiologist, so this is not my job. But I'll tell you what is my job, and that is to say to you, it doesn't matter how long it's going to last. You know, we think about that old nursery rhyme about Humpty Dumpty. He has already fallen off the wall. The breakage has already happened. It doesn't have to go any farther for us to figure out that we as a culture have, in a sense, been sprung farther than we have been sprung ever before. Unemployment, the economy, they've taken downward spirals that jobs have been released in such a fast pace that it's as bad as it's ever been since the Depression in all of our lifetimes. For all of us that are alive today, this is really, really bad stuff. It's really difficult times. And there are people who are literally perishing. So I'm wondering, in order to put things back like Humpty Dumpty and make things right again, sometimes we have to overcorrect. If you've ever tried to bend spring steel, sometimes you have to bend it beyond the point that you would have normally thought it should have been corrected to, and then let it spring back a little bit to the norm. And in a way, that's what we have to do with communication. We're going to have to communicate more now than what we think we should have had to, because there have been such poor communication for these past few months. Take, for instance, with your supervisor or your coach. Remember, we talk about that duck that's just one step ahead of you, the duckling, and you're following just one step behind that supervisor or coach you're working with. We're asking you to be present. We're asking you to show up, use Zoom or whatever you have to, listen a lot, ask lots of clarifying questions, not to intimidate, but to understand. Figure out what matters to your supervisor, and then be engaged. And we're asking you, be a part of making it happen. That's what we're asking you to do. Use email, use an app. If your team uses an app, use the phone, pick up the phone and call someone. Use Zoom, use FaceTime, use all five. Restore that connection. Don't assume anything. Don't assume that your supervisor is just fine with the way you've been working. Communicate and then over communicate so things will spring back to normal. Communicate with those you lead. In other words, if you're a supervisor, communicate with those you lead. We show the picture of the ducklings again because, again, you might be one step of somebody behind you who's following after. This is a part of that relational stewardship. It's part of our responsibility as leaders. Don't assume anything. Show your care. Show that you are there, and show your responsibility by bringing people back to the simple basics. Let them know what we're supposed to be doing. If you're a field coordinator, don't assume that your team leaders know. If you're a team leader, don't assume that your team members know. If you're a team member and you are leading others to Christ, don't assume that they're okay. Over-communicate now. Reestablish a stable and a caring community. If you previously had thought that a debriefing should take 30 minutes, and maybe that's what you've been allowing, now allow 60. Now allow 90. I was recently with one of our missionary families, and to be honest, one of the family members said, I felt rushed in my debrief. We're going to have to allow a bit more space, Doug, a bit more headroom. Now, she told me this not out of complaining. I actually had to beg for her to talk. She wasn't going to talk about it, which is another part of the damage that this virus is causing. This virus comes for the people who are vulnerable, but it also comes for those who are least suspecting. Today I read about a study, 40 and 50-year-olds who are now experiencing strokes after they've taken the coronavirus. And it's not a conclusive study by any means. It'll all have to be verified by peers. But what I'm saying is this virus is going to hit us in ways we haven't understood. And one of them is it's going to take out our willingness, our will to communicate, and it's also going to take out our will to listen. So I'm asking you today, come back. Come back to the norm of communicating. In general, try to create these win-win relationships. You know, Covey talks about that as well. And don't forget it. If you're tempted to fire somebody because doesn't look like they're doing their job, I'm just asking you, if you normally would have done that, just stop and think, how can I engage with this person and try a little bit harder first? Don't be so quick to let somebody go. Instead, let's try to figure out how can we make this a win-win relationship. That's the challenge, and it's the challenge we are asking you to accept today, to maintain, and not just maintain, to create teamwork, bonds that weren't there before, in the middle of social distancing, in the middle of physically distancing, while it's still in force, and it might be in force for weeks to come. I'm going to say this, and I'd like for you to hear me, and go ahead and imagine that it could be true even though you don't believe it. Social distancing could be in force for months to come. We have to prepare for it. We have to plan on it. We have to do the impossible. We have to recreate bonds of trust while social distancing is going on. Let's talk about partners, donors, friends of the org, churches, individuals, recruits, alumni, entire networks. You thought it was hard with the people that were on your team? Think about the people that empower your work. Maybe they haven't been able to hear lately how their own church is doing, let alone how you're doing. We're asking you to take into consideration that half of all churches are said to have taken a hit financially. And of those who've taken a hit, we're asking you to understand that a third of them have seen their budgets, their offerings cut in half. That's from a Lifeway study that was done with 400 pastors that they polled. What do you think they are worried about? It might not be people far away that they've never met. It might be the people who are right there in their own community. They're worried about those people and their jobs that they've lost. They're trying to figure out how they'll pay their mortgage of their church building. They don't want to cut missions. I'm convinced of that. But if it's a choice between being thrown out of their church building and losing the chance in months to come of recovering so they can re-empower missions versus cutting the missions budget for a while, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year, it could happen. And if they have to make a choice, what do you think they're going to choose? I was chairman of a missions committee in a local church. We had about 700 members. I think I was chairman of them, I forget how many years, but I watched this at work. Over and over again, the people who were the most likely to start bubbling up in the conversation about trimming were the people who were not communicating. I'm sorry, but it happened over and over again. In our committee and in committees, I'm convinced, like ours, all across the country. So what are you going to do? We're asking you to let people know how you are investing in the growth of the kingdom and why that matters where you are and where you've been. And if you are now out of the picture because you're now no longer in that geographic area, we're asking you to communicate why you matter and why your work matters now. And if you're not sure, we're asking you to talk to your supervisor and figure that out. We're asking you to pick up the phone and call people because they matter. Talk to the elder that you met when you raised support at that church. Talk to the people in that family. Now, if you are a partner church, you're a member of a missions team or maybe a missions committee chairperson and you're watching this video, we're asking you to try to pray for your workers because they're scared, frankly. They're anxious. They see these stats by Lifeway and they're not sure what's going to happen. And it's not just a job with them. It's a life. It's a calling. And they know that if they're pulled back, the people in their relational networks won't hear. If you can, offer them some kind of encouragement. Please encourage them. Try to offer them some kind of hope. Now, speaking to you as our workers again, what about the list of the 100 that we've talked about? The many on your list who are hurting. Maybe you've been going at a breakneck pace since you evacuated and you haven't had a chance to think about them yet. Pick up your WhatsApp application on your phone. Please let them know that you are with them still, even if you evacuated. This virus is cruel. Things could grow much, much worse before they get better. I hear all the time from researchers who are saying that they just can't quite believe that we're through the worst. If you've ever studied that 1918 Spanish flu epidemic at the end of World War I, you know that the second wave was much more serious than the first. People eased all the restrictions and the growth gains they had made. They eased on the distancing in 1918. And the virus came back and reinfected the people that hadn't been touched in the first wave. And hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives because folks quit too soon. Researchers are telling me all the time, it could happen. Today I heard in China, the city of Harbin, it was starting to happen there. A resurgence, a wave. You know that it started in China. That resurgence could happen where you work and where you live. The people on your list of 100 are going to be scared. Take nothing for granted. Reassure them things could get worse before they get better. Make disciples. Multiply groups. Pray, share, and train. Pray, share, and train. It's what we do. So to do it, we have to communicate. Just want to give an example of how we've tried to do this in the last few weeks. We learned through a trusted partner about this CARES Act before it even became law. And because of that, we felt an obligation, to whom the things are given, you're supposed to be able to give back to others. So we got John and our finance team working on the CARES Act for our org, for Team Expansion. And then we began recruiting a team of people, and we only had a couple of days to do it. That law was going to come into force very quickly. We recruited a whole team of people. I don't remember the exact number, something like 30 people who would make phone calls. And we divided up the list of all 6,000 Christian churches in the entire land. And we said, will you call these? Will you call these? Will you call these? And in a matter of 48 hours, a lot of those churches were called. Not all of them answered. And obviously it was tough to call all those places, but we did our best. We got the word out to hundreds. And it's a fun job for me to hear back from those churches. And I remember one phone call from a church secretary. She said, I had just finished attending your webinar and I wanted to say thanks because we heard about this act yesterday, but we didn't know what to do about it yesterday morning. I immediately called our church treasurer. We were lost because we didn't know where to go to try to get information. We don't have a lawyer in our church, so we didn't know where to go. We tried looking it up online, but to be honest, we were overwhelmed. At that very hour, we got a call from one of your team members. They told us about this webinar you're going to have. They asked for nothing in return. We've just completed the webinar, and now we've got the application. We know exactly what to do. Thank you. We felt a burden to communicate, and so we contacted hundreds of churches and individuals and invited them to take part. That's the kind of thing we're asking you to do, to go beyond the call. Picard said it best. Engage. That's what we're asking you to do. We're asking you to be the bridge. Be the bridge. Communicate in a way perhaps you've never done before. Over-communicate. Take the initiative to do it. Get your basics in hand. Take the initiative. Get engaged and communicate. We've got one last video in this series, and that'll be tomorrow. Thank you for taking part. I want to thank those who are watching maybe that are not a part of our org. And for you who are a part of our org, I want you to know how much it means. You've been emailing back and telling me that you're listening to these. That means a lot. But of course, like our trainers have told us, now I'm telling you, just passing along what I've been told by others. Knowing it's one thing, doing it is another. Let's do this. Thanks. God bless.